Clara Whitmore slammed both hands flat on the counter and looked the shopkeeper dead in the eye. "My father is dying," she said. "Not next week. Tonight." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. A woman near the window covered her mouth, not from sympathy, but to hide a smile. The shopkeeper stepped back like her desperation might be contagious, and somewhere in the back of that room a man laughed. Not loud, just enough. That was the moment Clara understood. In Harlan Creek, Texas in the fall of 1883, poverty wasn't misfortune. It was a crime they'd already convicted her of. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end, because what happens next will stay with you. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The dress had been her mother's. Clara knew people could see that. She knew by the way the fabric sat wrong across her shoulders, too narrow for her frame, too loose at the waist where her mother had been softer, more settled. She'd done what she could with it the night before, pulling a thread here, folding a seam there. But there was no fixing. The fact that the cotton had faded to the color of old dishwater, and the hem had been repaired so many times, the stitching looked like a scar running all the way around the bottom. She hadn't cared about that walking in. She'd had one thought, and one thought only. Get the medicine. Get back to the house. Keep her father breathing through another night. That was before the shopkeeper looked at her. His name was Gerald Pruitt, and he had the particular kind of mean that comes from never having wanted for anything. It wasn't a loud mean. It was quiet and practiced, like a man who'd spent years deciding who deserved his attention and who did not. He looked at Clara's dress. He looked at her hands, work rough, knuckle dry, the kind of hands that didn't belong to anyone in Harlan Creek who mattered. Then he looked away. "Mr. Pruitt," Clara said, "I need laudanum and—" "I heard you the first time. Then you heard me say my father is—" "I heard what you said." He didn't look up from the ledger he was pretending to write in. "Question is, whether you've got money to back it up." Clara set 3 coins on the counter. She'd counted them 4 times on the walk over. She knew exactly what they amounted to, and she knew it wasn't enough. But she also knew it was everything she had, and she'd decided the only thing left to do was put it down and ask the man to meet her halfway. Gerald Pruitt looked at the coins the way a man looks at something unpleasant on the bottom of his boot. "That doesn't cover it." "I know it doesn't cover all of it," Clara said. "I'm asking if you'd let me carry the rest as credit. I'll pay it back by end of month. I've been taking in sewing from— I don't extend credit to people who can't demonstrate means." He finally looked at her then full on, and his expression wasn't angry. It was worse than angry. It was bored. "You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand you perfectly," Clara said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "I'm asking you to make an exception." "I don't make exceptions." The store wasn't empty. That was the part Clara hadn't fully accounted for when she walked in. She'd been so fixed on the medicine, on the image of her father's chest rising and falling in that shallow, wrong way it had been rising and falling for 3 days, that she hadn't registered the other people in the room. But she registered them now. There were 6 of them. Mrs. Helena Cross, no relation to the cowboy who would come later, or maybe some distant relation. Harlan Creek was small enough that most names overlapped, was standing near the bolts of fabric with a woman Clara didn't know. Both of them had stopped pretending to look at cloth. There was a young man near the door who was grinning openly now, like this was entertainment he hadn't expected on a Tuesday morning. And there were others' faces, turning eyes, sharpening everyone very still in the way people get still when they smell trouble and want to see where it lands. Mrs. Helena Cross cleared her throat. "Perhaps you should try the church, dear," she said, and her voice had that specific honey-over-gravel quality that rich women in small towns develop when they want to sound charitable while saying something cutting. Reverend Moore sometimes assists with cases of need. "I don't need charity," Clara said. "I need medicine. I have money. I'm $3 short. I'm asking for 1 month's credit." "It's really not our concern, is it? the unknown woman said to no one in particular. The young man near the door laughed again, louder this time. Clara's hands were still flat on the counter. She could feel the 3 coins under her right palm, and she pressed down on them harder than she meant to because it gave her something to press against. She thought about her father. She thought about the way he'd looked at her this morning when she'd told him she was going to fix it the way he'd believed her, the way he'd nodded and closed his eyes with the specific trust of a man who had no other options, but also no doubts about his daughter. She couldn't go back empty-handed. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "please." That was when the laugh happened again. Not the young man this time, someone else, someone she couldn't locate. And Gerald Pruitt's expression shifted from boredom into something almost satisfied. And Clara felt the full weight of what was happening drop onto her like a physical thing. She was a spectacle. She'd walked in desperate and shown that desperation, and now it was entertainment for everyone in the room. And Gerald Pruitt wasn't going to give her the medicine, because the medicine wasn't the point anymore. The point was the moment. The point was the way she was standing here with her dead mother's dress and her 3 insufficient coins, and her pleas, her actual pleas, out loud in front of people who were going to remember it. The door opened behind her. She didn't turn around. She wasn't going to turn around. She kept her eyes on Gerald Pruitt's face and her hands on the counter, and she was trying to calculate, was there anyone else she could ask? Was there another way? Could she get word to the doctor in Millfield? Could she? How much is she short? The voice came from behind her, low, flat. The kind of voice that isn't trying to project but carries anyway, the way a river carries without effort, simply because it has somewhere to go, and nothing is going to stop it. Gerald Pruitt's expression changed. Clara turned. The man standing just inside the door was somewhere in his early 30s, though he carried himself older. He was lean in the way that comes from real work, rather than want, not thin, but stripped down to what's necessary. Dark hair, dark eyes, a face that had spent enough time outdoors to forget it had ever been young. He wore a dark brown vest over a light shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark trousers, boots worn at the heel. There was a holstered revolver at his hip, and he wore it the way men who've stopped thinking about guns wear them, like any other tool present and unremarkable. His hat was in his hand. He was looking at Gerald Pruitt, not at Clara, and there was something in the steadiness of his gaze that made the room feel smaller. "I asked a question," he said. Pruitt's pen was very still above his ledger. "Mr. Cross," he said carefully, "I wasn't aware this was any of your, how much is she short?" The silence had changed. Clara could feel it. The laughing young man near the door had stopped laughing. Mrs. Helena Cross, near the fabric, was very interested in a button she appeared to have just discovered on her sleeve. Nobody in the room was looking at Clara anymore, which was a new feeling, and she wasn't sure yet whether she was grateful for it. $3, Pruitt said. The man named Cross reached into his vest pocket, produced 3 silver dollars, and set them on the counter one at a time. Not slammed, not dropped. Set down with the deliberate patience of someone who has made a decision and is now simply executing it. "Ring her up," he said. "Now, Mr. Cross, I appreciate the gesture, but I didn't make a gesture." The voice stayed even. "I bought the medicine. Ring her up." Pruitt's jaw worked. He looked at the coins, then at Cross, then at the coins again. There was something he wanted to say. Clara could see it in the set of his shoulders, but he didn't say it. He reached under the counter instead, and there was the sound of glass moving, stoppers being pulled, measurements being made, and in 60 seconds, Clara had a brown paper package on the counter in front of her. She didn't reach for it immediately. She turned to look at the man called Cross. He was watching Pruitt, not her. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her then, just briefly. "I'll want the work in exchange," he said. "Not the money. I've got fence posts along the north pasture that need counting and logging. My foreman's records are a mess, and I can't tell what we've got versus what we're missing. You any good with figures?" It was such an unexpected question that it took her a moment to catch up to it. Yes, I was a bookkeeper's apprentice in "Monday morning," he said. "My ranch is 2 miles north on the Laredo Road. Tell whoever's on the gate that Ethan Cross sent you." He put his hat back on. He walked past her, and his arm almost brushed her shoulder, but didn't, and he opened the door, and then he stopped. He turned around. He looked at Gerald Pruitt first, then at Mrs. Helena Cross, then at the young man near the door who'd been laughing. He looked at each of them with an expression that contained nothing hostile and nothing warm, just a kind of absolute clarity, the look of a man who has categorized something and filed it and will not be forgetting it. "You people," he said, "ought to be ashamed." He walked out. The door closed behind him without a sound. For a moment, nobody in Harlan Creek General Goods moved or breathed or pretended to be doing anything at all. And then Clara reached out, picked up her package, tucked it under her arm, and walked to the door. She didn't look at any of them. Not Gerald Pruitt. Not Mrs. Helena Cross with her honey voice and her charity church suggestion. Not the young man who'd found it funny. She walked out into the Texas morning and kept walking until she was half a block down the road, and then she stopped. Put her back against the side wall of the barber shop and let herself shake for 30 seconds. Just 30. She counted them. Her father's medicine was in her hands, and the shaking was something she'd earned, and she allowed herself exactly that long, and then she stopped. It squared her shoulders and started walking north toward home. Ethan Cross had already disappeared. She didn't know which direction he'd gone. She hadn't seen a horse out front, but that didn't mean anything. She turned his face over in her mind as she walked that flat, steady, unsurprised expression and tried to make sense of what had just happened. He hadn't given her charity. He'd been precise about that. The work in exchange, not the money. He'd made a transaction out of it, and she understood in a way she was still processing that this was the merciful thing. If he'd just handed her money and walked away, she'd have spent the rest of her life thinking about it a certain way, categorizing herself in a certain column alongside all the other things that had happened to her since her mother died and her father got sick, and the money ran out, and Harlan Creek showed her exactly what it thought of people without money. Instead, she had a job. She had Monday morning and a ranch 2 miles up the Laredo Road and a foreman's records that needed sorting. She had something to do. Her father was awake when she got home, which scared her for a second, until she realized he was awake, and breathing, just lying with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, with the measured patience of a sick man who has learned to count his good moments. "You got it," he said when he saw the package. "I got it." "How much did it cost you?" "Exactly what I had," Clara said. She was already measuring out the dose hands steady, now the shaking gone. "Pa, do you know a man named Ethan Cross?" Her father's eyes moved. "Cross?" he said slowly. "Cross. Ethan Cross. He bought the old Harlan property, didn't he? Year before last, maybe. North side. Runs cattle. What do you know about him?" "Not much." Her father accepted the medicine maid, a face settled back. "Keeps to himself. Came from somewhere else. Heard he was a Pinkerton man at some point before he bought the land. Don't know why a man leaves that kind of work to run cattle, but then I don't know why a lot of men do a lot of things." He looked at her. "Why are you asking about Ethan Cross?" "He gave me work," Clara said. "Monday morning, bookkeeping." Her father was quiet for a long moment. "You going to take it?" "I already said yes." "Good." He closed his eyes. "Good. Don't let pride get in the way of useful Clara. Your mother never did." She sat with him until he fell asleep, which took most of an hour. Then she went to the small table in the corner that served as her desk and pulled out the ledger she'd been keeping their expenses. Their remaining funds, the calculations she ran and reran, because there was comfort in the running of them, even when the numbers didn't change. She went through it all again. With what Ethan Cross paid her, assuming it was reasonable, assuming she could manage the ranch work while keeping up the sewing, they might have 6 weeks of breathing room. Maybe 8. 8 weeks was a long time. 8 weeks ago, her mother had been alive. 8 weeks ago, she'd had no idea that Harlan Creek could look at a person the way it had looked at her this morning. She thought about the people in that store. She thought about the way the laughter had moved through the room, easy and comfortable, the laughter of people who feel certain of their position. She thought about Gerald Pruitt's bored face and Mrs. Cross's honey voice, and the specific quality of the silence that had fallen when Ethan Cross walked in, that sudden cessation of everything. She hadn't understood it at the time, but she understood it better now, turning it over. They were afraid of him. Not because he'd threatened anything. Because he hadn't. Because he'd been completely, perfectly still in himself. And there's nothing more frightening to people who've built their whole lives on performance than someone who genuinely doesn't need to perform. He'd said, "You people ought to be ashamed." 6 words, and then he'd left. Clara pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and started making a list of everything she knew about bookkeeping. It was a longer list than she'd expected. Her father had taught her when she was 12, had brought her into his ledger work because she had a mind for it, he said. A mind that liked things to add up, that got genuinely agitated when they didn't. She'd worked 2 years for a man named Harris in Abilene, before Harris's business went under, and she'd come home to care for her mother and then stayed to care for her father. And the bookkeeping had become something she did only for herself, for this small household, for the private satisfaction of understanding exactly where she stood. A foreman's records. She could do that. She could do that in her sleep. Monday morning came slow and cool, the sky flat and white, the way Texas skies go in late October, before they decide whether to give you weather or not. Clara was on the Laredo Road by 7, walking her good shawl around her shoulders. The good shawl had been a gift years ago, and it still had some dignity left in it. And the ranch came into view at 20 past 7, a proper spread, the kind of property that spoke of real investment rather than wishful thinking. The main house was solid timber and stone. The fencing was maintained. There were men moving around the outbuildings and horses in the near paddock, and the whole operation had the look of a place where someone was actually paying attention. The man on the gate was broad and weathered and looked at her without expression. "Ethan Cross sent me," Clara said. "I'm here for the bookkeeping work." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood aside. She found Ethan Cross in the barn, not in the house. He was talking to a younger hand about something to do with a horse's left foreleg, talking quietly, listening more than speaking. And when he heard Clara's footsteps, he turned and looked at her with the same flat assessing expression she remembered from the store. "You're early," he said. "I'm on time," Clara said. "You said Monday morning." "I said Monday morning. It's 7:22. "Is there a starting time I was supposed to know about?" Something moved through his expression, not quite a smile, not quite. "Come on then," he said, and handed the younger hand off with a few words, and led Clara across the yard and into the main house. The office was a disaster. She stopped in the doorway and looked at it. There were 2 crates of papers on the floor. There was a desk buried under what appeared to be at least a year's worth of receipts, ledger books, inventories, and correspondence. Some of it sorted into rough piles, and some of it clearly having slid off those piles onto the floor at some point and been left there. There was a ledger open on the desk with figures in 2 different hands, which meant 2 different people had been writing in it at 2 different times, which meant the records were almost certainly contradictory in places, and she was going to have to go back to the beginning to reconcile anything. "Your foreman did this," Clara said. "My last foreman. He left in July." Ethan Cross said it without inflection, which could mean anything. "The man I've got now is better with cattle than with numbers." "How many head are you running?" "That's part of what I need to know." Clara looked at him. "You don't know how many cattle you have." "I have estimates. I don't have verified numbers. There's a difference, and right now the difference matters." She looked back at the office. She thought about where you start with a mess like this. You start at the beginning. Always you go back to the oldest document you can find, and you work forward. And then she looked at Ethan Cross and said, "I'm going to need a full day to assess what we're dealing with before I can tell you how long the reconciliation will take." "Take the day," he said. "I'll have someone bring you dinner at noon." "I don't need—" "My hands eat at noon," he said. "You'll eat at noon. That's how it works here." He left her to it. She worked through the morning without stopping. The papers organized themselves slowly, reluctantly, like they were embarrassed about what she kept finding gaps in the inventory from March, that no one had bothered to account for a set of sale receipts that didn't match the ledger entries by what appeared to be a consistent 10%, which meant either the foreman had been skimming or he'd been consistently making the same arithmetic error, and she needed more data before she could tell which. At noon, a young woman brought her a plate of beans and bread and set it on the one clear corner of the desk and left without comment. Clara ate while she read. She was 3 months deep into the first crate by the time the light through the window started to angle toward afternoon. She didn't hear Ethan Cross come back. She just looked up at some point, and he was in the doorway watching her work. "What have you found?" he said. "Enough to know this is going to take the rest of the week," Clara said. "Possibly longer. Whoever was keeping your books wasn't just careless. There's a systematic discrepancy in the sale records that I need to trace back at least 18 months to understand." "Systematic," Cross said. He said it carefully, like a man who already suspects what the word means and is waiting to hear the rest. "I'm not ready to make any accusations," Clara said. "I need the full picture first. But the numbers don't add up in a way that's consistent with random error." Ethan Cross looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right, come back tomorrow. Same time." "I thought you said I was early." "You were." And this time, the not quite a smile was a little more visible. "7:30 then, since that seems to suit you." She gathered her notes. She'd brought her own paper, her own pen, and stood and found that her back ached in the specific way it aches when you've been bent over a desk for too long without noticing. She straightened and found Ethan Cross still in the doorway, and there was a moment of passing that was slightly more complicated than it should have been, because the doorway wasn't quite wide enough for two people to pass comfortably, and he stepped back to let her through, and she said thank you quietly, and he said nothing at all. She was halfway across the yard when his voice came after her. "Miss Whitmore." She turned. He was standing in the doorway of the house, and the afternoon light was behind him, and he had his hat in his hand again, the way he'd had it in the store. "What those people said to you yesterday," he said. "What they did." Clara waited. "That's not what this town is," he said. "Or it shouldn't be. I want you to know that." She looked at him for a moment. "With respect, Mr. Cross," she said. "That's easy to say when the town has never looked at you the way it looked at me." He held her gaze. He didn't argue with that. He just nodded once slowly, and she turned back toward the road and walked away, and she could feel him still standing there, watching, though she didn't look back to confirm it. 2 miles home, her father would be awake. She had notes in her hand that told the beginning of a story she hadn't fully understood yet, numbers that didn't add up in a systematic way. 18 months of discrepancy, a former foreman who'd left in July and left no forwarding address. She was already thinking about tomorrow. She was already thinking about where to start. She had not once on that entire walk home thought about the dress. By Thursday, Clara had found $12,000. Not in a drawer, not in a safe, in the numbers themselves, in the thin consistent gap between what the ranch had sold and what the ledger said it had sold month after month for 19 months straight. 10% off every transaction above $100. Clean enough to look like rounding if you weren't paying close attention. Systematic enough to be unmistakable once you were. She sat back in the chair and looked at what she'd laid out across the desk. 3 ledgers open side by side. A column of figures in her own hand running down the left margin of her notepaper, and at the bottom of that column, a number that had taken her 3 days to arrive at, and that she was still hoping she'd gotten wrong. She hadn't gotten it wrong. She'd checked it 4 times. She heard Ethan Cross come into the house at 3:30. Heard his boots in the hall. Heard him stop in the office doorway, the way he'd taken to stopping there without announcing himself, just present, waiting to see what she'd say. "Sit down," Clara said without looking up. There was a pause. Then the sound of the chair on the other side of the desk being pulled out. "That bad," he said. $12,430. She slid the notepaper across to him. 19 months. Your former foreman, a man named Davies, was that his name Davies was skimming 10% off every significant transaction and recording the remainder as the full amount. He'd have needed access to both the ledger and the customer receipts to do it. He had both. Ethan Cross looked at the paper. He looked at it for a long time without speaking, and Clara watched his face and saw something move through it that wasn't anger exactly. It was something quieter and colder than anger, the expression of a man recalibrating something he thought he already understood. Davies, he said, you trusted him. I hired him on a recommendation from a man I trusted. That's different. He set the paper down. Is this enough to bring to a sheriff? It's enough to start with. You'd want the original receipts from your buyers, the actual receipts they received, to compare against what's in your ledger. If the amounts don't match, that's your evidence. The discrepancy is consistent enough that even 2 or 3 confirmed examples would be compelling. And if Davies is already gone doesn't mean beyond reach, Clara said. Not if there's a warrant, and not if he's done this before, which... She hesitated, then decided he deserved the full thought. A scheme this clean suggests he has. Men don't invent something this careful on their first try. Cross was quiet again. Outside, one of the hands was calling to another about something in the far paddock, and a horse answered somewhere. And the afternoon light had gone, that particular flat gold that meant an hour of good daylight left. Clara had been here since 7:30. She hadn't noticed until right now. You figured all this out in 3 days, Ethan Cross said. The discrepancy was in the first ledger. Once I knew what I was looking for, the rest was just confirming it. My last bookkeeper had those ledgers for a year. Your last bookkeeper, Clara said carefully, may not have been looking for the same things I was looking for. Cross looked at her. Meaning I came in assuming something was wrong and worked backward from there. If you're not suspicious to start with, it's easy to miss. She paused. Or your last bookkeeper may have had reasons not to find it. The silence stretched out between them, and Clara let it stretch. She'd learned in 3 days that Ethan Cross was a man who needed space to think, who didn't fill silence with noise the way most people did, and that if you were patient, the thoughts he arrived at were usually worth waiting for. That's a serious thing to suggest, he said finally. I know it is. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm telling you what the numbers suggest, and what the numbers suggest is that this was invisible for a reason. Whether that reason is incompetence or complicity, I can't tell you. He stood up. He walked to the window, not dramatically, not pacing, just moving the way a man moves when he needs to be standing instead of sitting, and looked out at the yard. What do you need to finish the full report? He said. 2 more days for the remaining crates. And I'd like to write up a clean summary you can take to the sheriff in Millfield, something that explains the methodology, so he understands how the figures were derived. Can you do that? I've never written one for law enforcement specifically, Clara said. But the structure isn't different from any other financial summary. The important thing is that the logic is airtight. Cross turned from the window and looked at her the way he sometimes did, directly, without the social softening most people employed when they looked at someone, as if he'd decided some time ago that looking away was a form of dishonesty. Why are you so good at this? He said. Clara blinked. It was the last question she'd expected. I beg your pardon? This, the numbers, the way you think about them. He wasn't asking it unkindly. He was asking it the way he asked everything, like a man who wants to understand something and has decided the most efficient path is to ask directly. Where did you learn it? My father taught me the foundations, Clara said. I worked for a bookkeeper in Abilene for 2 years after that. But mostly, she stopped, surprised to find herself saying this. Mostly, I just like the way numbers work. They don't change depending on who's looking at them. They don't care who's in the room or what dress they're wearing. 2 + 2 is 4 for everyone. She hadn't meant to say that last part. It came out before she could stop it, and it sat there between them with its meaning very clear, and she waited for Cross to do something awkward with it, He didn't. He just said, "That's a good way to think about it," and picked up his hat from the corner of the desk where he'd set it and said, "I'll have someone ride to Millfield tomorrow to let the sheriff know we're coming. I'd like you there when I make the report if you're willing." "I'm willing." "The pay for this week's work," he said. "I'm adding a bonus for the investigation. Whatever you found, the number's bigger than what I hired you for." "The deal was for fence post records," Clara said. "The deal was for bookkeeping work. This is bookkeeping work. I'm paying accordingly." He said it with the same finality he'd used in the store when he'd told Gerald Pruitt to ring her up, the tone of a man who has made a decision and does not intend to revisit it. "I'll also want to talk to you about whether this is something you'd consider on a more regular basis. The ranch needs someone. Not a foreman, someone who understands the money side. Someone I can trust." Clara looked at him for a moment. "You barely know me," she said. "I know what you found in 3 days," Cross said. "I know what your hands looked like when you came into Pruitt's store, and I know what you didn't do, which is beg even when you were damn close to it. And I know you just told me something about my last bookkeeper that most people would have kept to themselves because it was easier." He met her eyes. "That's enough to start with." She walked home that evening in the dark, which she hadn't done before, and she was halfway up the Laredo Road before she realized she'd been walking faster than usual. There was something moving in her chest that she didn't quite have a word for yet. Not happiness exactly. Not relief. Something more structural than either of those, the feeling of something shifting into a position it had always been meant to occupy. She told her father about the $12,000 over supper. He sat up straighter than he had in weeks. "Davies," he said. "Tom Davies. I don't know his first name. Big man, red hair going gray at the temples. I never met him. He was gone before I started." Her father settled back thinking. "There was a Tom Davies worked for the Harlan operation about 8 years ago before Cross bought the property. Always seemed too smart for what he was doing. Too comfortable." He looked at his daughter. "You found all that in 3 days." "The pattern wasn't hidden well," Clara said. "He just counted on nobody looking." "Men like that always do." Her father picked up his spoon again. "What's Cross going to do?" "Sheriff in Millfield. He wants me there to explain the figures." Her father nodded slowly. Then he said, "How is he Cross?" It was the most neutral question in the world, and it felt like the least neutral question in the world, and Clara did not look up from her bowl when she answered it. "He's serious," she said. "He doesn't waste words. He asked good questions." "That's not really what I asked." "That's the answer I have," Clara said, and her father had enough sense to let it go. The trip to Millfield was 2 days later. Cross had a wagon ready at 7, not a fine wagon, a working one. The kind that said this was a business trip, and nothing else. And Clara was waiting at the gate when he pulled up with a hand named Reyes riding alongside. She climbed up without being helped, which she'd have done regardless, and Cross didn't offer help, which told her something about him. They rode mostly in silence for the first hour. Not uncomfortable silence, the functional kind, the kind between people who are both thinking about the same problem from different angles. It was Cross who broke it. "Did you sleep?" he said. "Enough." She'd been up until midnight refining the summary, but that wasn't information he needed. "You?" "Some." He watched the road. "I keep going back over who knew what. People who came through the ranch. People Davies talked to. It's possible nobody knew except Davies." "It's possible," Cross said in a tone that meant he didn't quite believe it. Clara thought about that. "You're thinking about the buyer side," she said. "Whether any of the customers were getting a cut." Cross glanced at her sideways. "That occurred to you too." "The scheme works better if there's someone on the other end falsifying the receipt they kept. Otherwise, you've got a copy that doesn't match the ledger, and that's a risk Davies wouldn't have wanted." She'd been turning this over for 2 days and hadn't said it aloud yet because she hadn't been sure. She was still not entirely sure. "It's not something I can prove from your records alone." You'd need to look at the receipts held by the buyers. Some of those buyers are prominent men in this county, Cross said. I know. The sheriff may not be enthusiastic about examining their records. I know that too. Clara folded her hands in her lap. That's why the summary I've written lays out the methodology before it lays out the conclusion. If the math is clear enough that anyone can follow it, it's harder to dismiss. Cross didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, You thought about that. I thought about it. Most people walking into a sheriff's office with something like this, they lead with the accusation. They want to be believed. I want to be understood, Clara said. Being believed follows from that if the work is good enough. The sheriff in Millfield was a broad, careful man named Aldridge, who had the particular stillness of someone who'd heard a great many stories and was not predisposed to believe any of them without cause. He looked at Clara when Cross introduced her, looked at her the way men in his position sometimes looked at women doing unexpected things, with a wariness that wasn't quite hostility, but wasn't welcome either. Then she put the summary on his desk. She walked him through it. She didn't perform it. She didn't try to impress him or hurry him or simplify it to the point of condescension. She walked him through it the way she'd have walked anyone through it, methodically, patiently, answering the questions he asked and waiting out the ones he was still forming. He asked good questions. She respected that. At the end, he sat back and looked at the papers for a long time. You put this together yourself, he said, not hostile, genuinely asking. Yes. How long did it take you? The full analysis 4 days, the summary an evening. Aldridge looked at Cross. You're lucky, he said simply. Cross didn't agree or disagree. He looked at Clara just briefly and then back at the sheriff. What can you do? Cross said. I can open an investigation. I can get warrants for Davies's last known address. If he's still in the state, we'll find him. The buyer side. Aldridge paused. That's more delicate, some of those names. I understand delicate, Cross said. I want it done right more than I want it done fast. But I want it done. There was something in his voice when he said that, not a threat. Something less dramatic and more certain than a threat. The voice of a man who will not be redirected once he's decided on a direction, and Aldridge heard it because he nodded and said he'd be in touch within the week. They were back on the road to Harlan Creek by early afternoon. The sky had made up its mind about weather and decided against it, and the light was thin and clear and cold, in the way that October light gets when it's thinking about November. Reyes rode behind them and said nothing, which was apparently his natural state. Cross said, You did well in there. I presented the evidence, Clara said. You convinced him. That's different from presenting evidence. He was quiet for a moment. Aldridge has seen a lot of people come in with a lot of claims. He doesn't move easily. You moved him. Clara thought about that. She thought about what she'd said to Cross earlier in the week about numbers being the same for everyone, regardless of who was looking at them. The work was honest, she said. That's all it takes, if you do it well enough. You really believe that? I have to, Clara said, and she said it without self-pity, as a simple statement of the thing she'd decided was true. Because it's the only thing I've got that nobody can take away. The dress? She stopped, surprised she'd said it out loud. Everything else can be taken. What I can do with numbers can't be as long as I keep doing it. Cross said nothing for a while after that. The wagon rolled, the road unfolded. Somewhere to the west there was a line of clouds building that might mean rain by morning. I meant what I said, Cross said finally. About regular work. The ranch needs someone who understands the accounts. Someone who won't be managed. You said won't be managed, Clara said. You mean someone who'll tell you things you don't want to hear. Exactly that. And if the sheriff's investigation opens up something bigger, if there are buyers involved, prominent men, and the accounting work becomes part of a legal proceeding. Cross glanced at her. Then you'd be part of a legal proceeding, he said. Is that a problem? Clara thought about Gerald Pruitt's face. She thought about Mrs. Helena Cross and her honey voice. She thought about the young man near the door who had found it funny. She thought about what it would mean to stand in front of those people, not begging, not desperate, not 3 coins short of what she needed, but standing there as the person who had built the case, that unraveled something they'd all been content to ignore. "No," she said. "It's not a problem." The wagon rolled north. Harlan Creek waited small and certain of itself, the way small towns are always certain of themselves. It didn't know yet what was coming. It didn't know the name of the woman who was going to bring it. But Clara Whitmore did. Sheriff Aldridge moved faster than Clara had expected. Within 4 days of their visit to Millfield, word had come back to Cross that a warrant had been issued for Thomas Davies' last known address, a boarding house in San Antonio, and that 2 of the buyer names in Clara's summary had been asked to produce their original receipts for comparison. She learned this not from Cross directly, but from Reyes, who mentioned it in passing while she was working through the last of the document crates on Friday morning, and she filed the information away and kept working. What she didn't expect was what Cross told her that same afternoon when he came into the office and stood in the doorway with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It wasn't the cold, recalibrating look from earlier in the week. It was something more guarded than that, something careful. "Gerald Pruitt," he said, "is one of the buyer names." Clara set down her pen. "His receipt," Cross continued, "is $12 off on a transaction from 8 months ago. Aldridge's deputy rode out to collect it this morning. Pruitt told him he'd need time to locate his records." "People who have nothing to hide don't need time to locate their records," Clara said. "No, they don't." Cross came the rest of the way into the office and sat down. "He's also been asking around town about you, asking what you're doing out here, who you're working for, what kind of work it is." Clara felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, not quite something adjacent to it. "How do you know that?" "Because this is a small town and people talk to me." He said it without pride. "Mrs. Alderman at the post office, one of the hands who drinks at the saloon where Pruitt drinks. He's not being subtle about it." "What is he saying?" Cross looked at her directly. "That a woman of your circumstances has no business handling a man's financial records, that it's inappropriate, that anything I think I've found is probably the result of poor arithmetic on the part of whoever I hired to look at the books." Clara absorbed that. She sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with something unpleasant that you need to understand fully before you can respond to it. "He's trying to discredit the work before the investigation reaches him," she said. "That's what it looks like." "Has he spoken to Aldridge?" "Not that I know of, but he's got friends in Millfield, the kind of friends who play cards with the kind of men who sit on the county board." Cross leaned forward, forearms on the desk. "I want you to know what you're walking into. If this gets bigger, and I think it's going to get bigger, Pruitt will make it about you, about your dress, and your father, and every reason this town has already decided you don't count. He'll do it because it's easier than explaining his receipts." Clara looked at her hands. They were ink-stained from the morning's work, knuckles dry from the cold that had come in with November. She thought about standing in Pruitt's store with 3 coins on the counter. She thought about the particular texture of his boredom, the way he'd looked at her like she was a problem he hadn't caused and didn't intend to solve. "Let him," she said. Cross watched her. "My work is documented," she said. "Every figure I derived, every comparison I made, I wrote down the method alongside the result. If he wants to argue with the arithmetic, he's welcome to try. He'll need someone who understands bookkeeping to do it, and anyone who understands bookkeeping will arrive at the same numbers I did." She met Cross's eyes. "He's not afraid of my arithmetic. He's afraid of what my arithmetic proves." Cross held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "I want Reyes riding you to and from the ranch until this is settled. I don't need an escort. I know you don't need one. I'm asking you to accept one." He said it without the commanding flatness he sometimes used, said it almost quietly in a register she hadn't heard from him before. "Pruitt is a small man who does small things. Small men who feel cornered do unpredictable things. Indulge me." Clara thought about arguing. She looked at his face and decided not to. "Fine," she said. But Reyes stays outside. Something that was almost amusement moved across Cross's expression. Reyes prefers outside, he said. She finished the last crate by Sunday. The complete picture, laid out in a fresh ledger she'd purchased herself and would present as part of the formal record, was worse than the original 12,000. When you accounted for the discrepancies she'd found in the supply purchasing records, a secondary scheme smaller and less consistent that had probably been Davies testing the water in his first months on the job. The total came to just under $15,000 over 22 months. She brought it to Cross on Monday morning. He read the full summary without speaking. He was a slow, thorough reader, the kind who goes back and rereads sentences rather than moving on when something doesn't fully land, and she let him take his time. When he finished, he closed the ledger and pressed his palm flat on the cover and sat there for a moment with his eyes on the middle distance. 15,000, he said. 14,840. I'd rather understate than overstate. You found a second scheme. A smaller one. Supply purchases, not sales. It suggests he was running both simultaneously, which means he was either very confident or very greedy. She paused. Or both. Does Aldridge know about the supply side yet? No. I wanted you to see it first. She reached over and opened the ledger to the page she'd marked. The methodology is the same. I can add an addendum to the existing summary tonight and have it to Aldridge by Wednesday. Cross looked at the page. He looked at her. You worked through the weekend, he said. I wanted to finish. Clara. He said her name for the first time without miss in front of it, and neither of them acknowledged it, but it was there. I told you there was no deadline. The investigation is already open. I know there was no deadline, she said. I set my own. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he looked back at the ledger. Wednesday is fine, he said. I'll send Reyes with you when you take it to Aldridge. The ride to Millfield on Wednesday was the first time Clara had been away from either the ranch or her father's house since the investigation began, and she hadn't realized until she was out on the open road how much the walls of the office had been closing in around her. Not unpleasantly, she'd been absorbed in the work, in the way she only got absorbed when the work was genuinely interesting, but the wide, flat sky and the cold air and the horse moving under her borrowed from Cross's stable, because Reyes had insisted she couldn't ride double on a wagon while carrying legal documents, did something to her breathing she hadn't known needed doing. Reyes rode beside her and said, as he almost always said, nothing. She was learning to appreciate him. Aldridge's office smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and had the particular organized chaos of a place where serious work got done without much ceremony. He was behind his desk when they came in, and there was another man in the room, younger, sharp-featured with the clean clothes and the particular quality of stillness that Clara had learned to associate with men who worked in law, but not in the physical sense. Miss Whitmore, Aldridge said, standing. This is Harlan Voss. He's an attorney out of Austin consulting on the investigation. Voss looked at her with frank assessment. You're the woman who compiled the financial records, he said. I am. I've looked at the original summary. He said it without preamble, which she respected. It's thorough, better than most I've seen from professional accountants. Thank you, Clara said, and set the new addendum on Aldridge's desk. There's more. She walked them through the supply purchasing scheme. Voss asked better questions than Aldridge, more precise, more interested in the logical structure of the evidence than in the story it told. And she answered each one carefully, exactly, without elaboration, where elaboration wasn't needed. Halfway through, he picked up a pencil and started making notes. When she finished, there was a silence of the kind that means people are thinking rather than the kind that means people have nothing to say. Gerald Pruitt, Voss said, looking at Aldridge. We've got his receipt, Aldridge said. He produced it yesterday. Amount matches what we expected, which is to say, it matches the ledger, not the seller's copy. Then his copy was altered, Clara said. That's what it looks like. Aldridge's expression was neutral in the way of a man deciding how much to say. Pruitt has retained his own attorney. Man named Colfax comes up from Laredo when Pruitt needs him. They're arguing the discrepancy is a clerical error. 19 months of consistent 10% clerical errors, Clara said. Yes, Aldridge said. We made that point. Colfax was not swayed. He paused. He also made some remarks about the qualifications of whoever compiled the financial analysis. I assumed he would. He'll make more, Voss said. He was looking at Clara with the same frank assessment he'd brought in at the start, but it had shifted into something more like calculation. If this goes to trial, and I believe it will, you'll be the primary witness on the financial evidence. Colfax will try to dismantle the methodology. He'll question your credentials, your access to the records, your motives. My motives, Clara said. He'll suggest you have a reason to fabricate evidence against Pruitt. Given the incident in the store, Voss glanced at her. I assume you're aware that's already a matter of local discussion. I assumed it would be. How do you feel about testifying? Clara looked at him evenly. I feel fine about it, she said. The evidence is documented. Every step I took is written down alongside every result I produced. If Mr. Colfax wants to argue with the methodology, he's welcome to present his own accountant who can demonstrate where I went wrong. He won't find one because I didn't go wrong. She held Voss's gaze. I've been dismissed once in Harlan Creek for not being the right kind of person. It didn't change the numbers then, and it won't change them in a courtroom. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he made one more note and capped his pen. No, he said quietly. It won't. The ride back was longer than the ride out because the wind had come up from the north, and it had that particular November edge that gets into your collar, regardless of how tight you've pulled it. Reyes said nothing as expected. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and thought about Gerald Pruitt sitting across from his attorney in some warm Harlan Creek room, trying to construct a story around a receipt that didn't match. She thought about the way he'd looked at her coins on his counter. The boredom of it. The practiced, polished cruelty of a man so certain of the order of things that he didn't even need to be angry about it. He could just be bored. He hadn't been bored when his attorney talked to Aldridge. She was willing to bet on that. Cross was in the yard when they came back, talking to two hands near the equipment shed, and he looked up when he heard the horses. He didn't come over immediately, finished what he was saying first, which she'd also come to expect from him, the refusal to let one thing interrupt another thing prematurely, and then walked over with his hands in his pockets and his hat pushed back slightly, and looked up at her with that direct patient look. How is Aldridge? There's an attorney from Austin, Clara said. Voss, he's good. He's seen the documents, and he thinks it will go to trial. Cross absorbed that without visible reaction, which was also something she'd come to expect. And Pruitt retained his own attorney. They're calling it clerical error. She swung down from the horse she'd gotten more comfortable with the borrowed mare over the week, more fluid in the movement, and handed the reins to Reyes. He'll come after my credentials, Voss warned me. Does that change anything for you? No. Cross nodded once slowly. You want to come in? There's coffee. It was such a plain and ordinary invitation that it caught her slightly off guard. Not because it was strange, but because somewhere in the past 2 weeks, the office and the desk and the end-of-day accounting of what had been found had become something she didn't have a word for yet, some structure that had built itself without her specifically noticing. Yes, she said. All right. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and the remains of whatever had been cooked at midday, and the cook a quiet woman named Esperanza, who had given Clara exactly one appraising look on her first day, and then proceeded to feed her at noon without further comment, was not there. Cross poured coffee from the pot on the stove and set a cup in front of her without asking how she took it, which meant he'd noticed. Which meant he paid more attention than he let on. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Voss is going to want me in Austin, she said. At some point. To review the compiled evidence with him before trial. I know. That would be, she calculated, at least 3 days, possibly more. I know Clara. He said her name again naturally, the way you say someone's name when you've stopped keeping track of whether you're using it. You don't have to manage my expectations about this. I knew what this investigation was going to require when I opened it. I'm not managing your expectations. I'm making sure you have the full information. Then I have it. He sat down across from her with his own coffee, and there was a moment of quiet between them that had a different quality than the working quiet, less purposeful. More settled, the quiet of people who have spent enough time in each other's company to have established something without explicitly deciding to. Why did you leave the Pinkertons? Clara said. She hadn't planned to ask it. It came out the way things sometimes come out when you've been thinking about a question long enough that it starts looking for its own exit. Cross looked at her. He wasn't surprised, or if he was, he didn't show it. He held his coffee cup with both hands the way she was holding hers and looked at the table for a moment. I was good at the job, he said. That's not an answer. No. He was quiet for a moment. There was a case. A man we were investigating, fraud land acquisition scheme, nothing complicated. He had a family, wife, 2 daughters. The way the Pinkertons wanted to work it, the family would have been collateral, was the word they used. He said the word flatly, without inflection, which made it worse. I didn't work it that way. I closed the case differently, and the agency and I had a disagreement about methods, and I found I agreed with myself more than I agreed with them. So I bought land. Clara looked at him. The family, she said. They were fine. The man went to prison, which was right. His wife moved to her sister's in Kansas and took the girls and built something else. He looked up. I know because I made sure to know. It seemed like the minimum. She held his gaze and felt something shift in the way she'd been holding the last 2 weeks in her mind, the careful professional accounting of what this was, what she was doing here, what the arrangement between them consisted of. It was still all of those things. It was also something else. Something that had been accumulating in the doorway appearances, and the direct questions, and the 7:30 start time, and the cup of coffee with exactly the right amount of nothing in it. She looked away first. She looked at her cup. Gerald Pruitt, she said, bringing it back to ground, is going to tell people in this town that I fabricated evidence against him because of what happened in his store. He's going to say I had a grievance, and I used your investigation to pursue it. He can say what he likes. It will be believed by some people. Some people, Cross said, will believe what they need to believe regardless of evidence. That's always been true. He set down his cup. But a courtroom isn't some people. A courtroom is 12 men looking at your work against Colfax's argument. And your work is going to win that, Clara, because it's the truth and it's documented. And there is no version of this where Pruitt's receipt matches his ledger entry by accident 19 times in a row. His voice was steady and certain, and not performing certainty, just stating it the way you state things that are simply true. You know that. I know that, she said. Then stop carrying the part you can't change, and carry the part you can. She looked at him. Is that what you do? He considered that with genuine seriousness, the way he considered everything. I try, he said. I don't always manage it. She walked home that evening with Reyes at a distance behind her. He kept a respectful 50 yards, which she appreciated, and the stars were out in the way. They get in a Texas November, sharp and cold and indifferent, and more numerous than seems possible until you're standing under them. Her father was asleep when she got in. She checked his breathing better this week, steadier, the medicine doing what it was supposed to do, and sat at her small desk for a few minutes without lighting the lamp. Pruitt was going to come at her. She understood that clearly now. Not through the law, he had no legal ground to stand on, and his attorney likely knew it, but through the town, through the whispers and the over-the-fence conversations, and the quiet withdrawal of social permission that small towns used to discipline people who stepped out of their assigned places. She thought about that for a while in the dark. Then she lit the lamp, opened her ledger, and began preparing her testimony. The whispers started the week before Christmas. Clara heard them the way you hear things in a small town. Not directly, never directly, but in the pause before a woman at the dry goods counter finished her sentence. In the way Mrs. Helena Cross found somewhere else to look, when Clara passed her on the boardwalk, in the way the sewing work that had been coming in steadily through October and November slowed, and then, in the second week of December, stopped entirely. 3 women who had been sending her alterations and mending sent nothing. No explanation. Just silence, which was its own kind of explanation. Her father noticed before she said anything. "You're not sleeping," he said one morning. He was sitting up at the table now most mornings, which was progress enough that she kept track of it. "I sleep fine." "You're up before 5 every day this week." "I have work to do." "You have thinking to do," he said with the accuracy of a man who had known her for 24 years. "There's a difference, and you know it." He watched her pour his coffee. "What are they saying?" She set the pot down. She'd been deciding for a week whether to tell him and had arrived each time at the same place he deserved to know, and pretending she could manage it entirely alone was a form of dishonesty she didn't want between them. "Pruitt's attorney sent a letter to Voss in Austin," she said, "claiming that I approached the bookkeeping work with a predetermined conclusion, that I manipulated the figures to implicate his client, and that the discrepancies I identified are the result of my own errors rather than deliberate fraud." She said it evenly the way she'd been practicing saying it to herself. "He's also been telling people in town that Mr. Cross hired me for reasons that have nothing to do with bookkeeping." Her father was quiet for a moment. "What kind of reasons?" "The kind men invent when they want to make a woman's work seem like something other than work." He set his cup down. He said a word Clara had never heard him say in front of her before, and she found she wasn't shocked by it. "Pruitt," he said more controlled, "is a man who has spent 30 years in this town being owed things. Money deference the benefit of every doubt. He doesn't know what to do with someone who won't give him what he's owed." He looked at his daughter. "What does Cross say?" "That Pruitt can say what he likes." "And what do you say?" Clara thought about the lamp burning past midnight. She thought about the pages of testimony notes, cross-referenced, annotated every logical step spelled out so that there was no gap a good attorney could push through. She thought about Voss's voice on the matter, calm and precise, when she'd sent him her response to Colfax's letter by courier. The methodology speaks for itself. "Continue preparing." "I say the same thing," she said. "But it's easier to say on some days than others." Her father nodded. He didn't offer comfort he didn't have. That was something she'd always valued about him. "Keep going," he said simply. She kept going. The trial date was set for the second week of January. Voss rode up from Austin in late December to spend 3 days going through the evidence with Clara, and they worked at the ranch because Cross had offered the dining room table, and it was bigger than anything Clara had access to at home. She spread the ledgers across it in chronological order and walked Voss through each one with the same patience she'd walked Aldridge through it months before, and Voss asked questions that were sharper this time, more adversarial. He was practicing Colfax's arguments against her. She understood testing for weaknesses. He found 2 places where her notation was ambiguous. She corrected them that evening and showed him the corrections the next morning, and he looked at them and said, "Good," in the tone of a man who doesn't give the word freely. Cross came in at the end of the second day and sat at the far end of the table while Voss summarized his assessment. He listened without interrupting, which was his way, and when Voss finished, he looked at Clara and said, "Are you ready?" "Yes," she said. It was the truest thing she'd said in weeks. On the morning of the last day Voss was there, Cross asked her to walk with him while Voss reviewed documents. She didn't ask where. She just put on her shawl and followed him out into the cold gray December morning, and they walked the perimeter of the near paddock without particular direction or purpose, their breath making small clouds between them. "Colfax is going to put you through it," Cross said. "I know." He's good at reading people. He'll look for the thing that rattles you and press on it. Then I need to make sure nothing rattles me. That's not how it works, Cross said, not unkindly. He'll find something. He finds something with everyone. The question isn't whether he rattles you, it's what you do when he does. He was quiet for a few paces. What rattles you, Clara? She thought about deflecting. She thought about how she had a good answer prepared for that question, a clean, composed answer that would serve perfectly well in almost any context. She looked at the fence line in front of her and decided that whatever this was between her and Ethan Cross, it deserved something better than a prepared answer. Being seen wrong, she said. I can handle being dismissed. I've had practice. But being understood incorrectly, having someone decide what I am, and refuse to look at the evidence, that's the thing that gets under my skin. Cross walked beside her. Because you can't correct it with logic. Because you can't correct it with logic, she confirmed. Every other problem I've ever had there was a right answer somewhere that I could work toward. A sum that would come out correctly if I was patient enough. But someone who's decided you're a certain kind of person. She stopped, then started again. That's not a math problem. There's no correct methodology. No, Cross said. There isn't. They had reached the far corner of the paddock. The wind was coming across open country, and it was the specific kind of cold that clarifies things, that strips everything down to what's actually present. You knew that, she said, when you walked into Pruitt's store. He looked at her sidelong. Knew what? That there was nothing you could say that would change the way those people were. That the words weren't for them. She turned to look at him directly. Who were they for? Cross was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, I don't know. I just knew that someone needed to say it. He paused. Maybe I said it for myself as much as anything. I'd been in that town 8 months, and I'd watched how it worked, and I was tired of watching. You could have kept watching. It would have cost you nothing. It would have cost me something, he said. I just couldn't have named what. Clara looked at him. In 24 years of knowing people, she had met very few who said exactly what they meant without decoration, without the social performance that made most conversation into a kind of elaborate theater where everyone agreed to pretend the stage was real. Ethan Cross said what he meant. It was the most disarming quality she had ever encountered in a person, and she still hadn't entirely figured out how to handle it. Colfax will press on the personal angle, she said, bringing herself back to the ground that felt safer. The suggestion that there's something between us that motivated the investigation. I know. It's not true. I know that too. I need to know if you're comfortable with Clara. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, which forced her to stop as well. I'm not a man who does things he's not comfortable with. I opened the investigation because there was fraud and it needed to be found. I hired you because you were the right person to find it. Whatever Colfax says in that courtroom about my motives or yours, I know what the truth is. So do you. He held her gaze. That's enough. She looked at him for a moment. Something tightened in her chest, and she didn't examine it closely. Yes, she said. All right. They walked back to the house. The trial opened on a Tuesday in January in the county courthouse in Millfield, and Harlan Creek turned out for it the way small towns turn out for things that are partly about justice and partly about spectacle. Clara arrived with Cross and Reyes and found seats already taken by people she recognized. The young man who had laughed in Pruitt's store was near the back, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and an expression of interested expectation, as if he hadn't decided yet which side he was rooting for. Pruitt sat at the defendant's table in his best suit, which was a very good suit, the suit of a man who has never had to decide between medicine and clothing. His attorney Colfax sat beside him, tall, white-haired, with the particular controlled patience of a man who had spent his career making juries doubt what they'd seen with their own eyes. Clara sat behind Voss at the plaintiff's table and kept her hands folded in her lap, and her face neutral and her breathing steady. Her testimony notes were in the leather case at her feet. She didn't need them. She knew every figure she'd cited well enough to recite them in her sleep, but she'd brought them because their presence was its own kind of steadiness. Voss presented the financial evidence methodically and well. He walked the jury through the scheme, through the 19 months of consistent 10% discrepancies, through the supply purchasing fraud that ran alongside it, through the matching of Pruitt's receipt to the corresponding ledger entry and the gap between them. He presented Clara's full summary as evidence and explained each section. 2 of the buyers from whom Aldridge had collected receipts testified about their transactions. Their testimony was simple and damaging, and Colfax's cross-examination of them produced nothing useful. Then Voss called Clara. She walked to the witness stand with her hands at her sides and her back straight and sat down, and she looked at the courtroom, the way she'd been practicing, looking at it in her mind for 3 weeks as a room full of people who were about to hear the truth from someone who understood it. Voss's questions were precise, and she answered them precisely. She explained the methodology. She explained the notation system. She explained why a 10% consistent discrepancy across 19 months could not be attributed to arithmetic error. She explained the supply purchasing scheme and how it related to the primary fraud. She spoke clearly and without elaboration, and she did not look at Gerald Pruitt while she did it. Then Colfax stood up. He was good as advertised. He started gently, almost collegially, asking her about her background, her training, where she'd studied under whom for how long. She answered each question in the same even tone. "So you have no formal certification as an accountant?" he said. "There is no formal certification system for accountants in Texas," Clara said, "as I believe you know." A small sound from the gallery. Colfax absorbed it without reaction. "But you have no institutional training, no university degree, no professional record prior to your work for Mr. Cross." "I have 2 years of professional experience in Abilene and 4 years of household financial management, both of which required the same skills and produced the same kind of documentation you have in front of you." She held his gaze. "I'm happy to walk through any portion of the methodology you'd like to question." "We'll get to that," Colfax said pleasantly. "First, I'd like to establish the circumstances under which you came to work for Mr. Cross." He paused, and Clara felt the pause the way you feel something drawing back before it comes forward. "You went to Mr. Pruitt's store on October 9th of last year. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And you had an interaction with Mr. Pruitt that you found distressing." "I went to purchase medicine for my father," Clara said. "I was $3 short. Mr. Pruitt declined to extend credit. And shortly afterward, Mr. Cross intervened on your behalf. Mr. Cross purchased the medicine and offered me employment in exchange. Employment that placed you in possession of Mr. Pruitt's business records. Employment that placed me in possession of Mr. Cross's business records," Clara said. "Mr. Pruitt's receipts were among the documents his buyers produced at Sheriff Aldridge's request. I didn't have access to them until the investigation was already open." Colfax shifted slightly. She'd anticipated that line and cut it off at the right place, and she could see from the small adjustment in his posture that he'd noticed. He moved on. "Isn't it true," he said, "that you arrived at Mr. Cross's ranch with a predetermined hostility toward Mr. Pruitt, and that this hostility influenced the way you examined—" "No," Clara said. "It is not true." Colfax looked at her. Most witnesses, she understood, did not interrupt him. "Miss Whitmore, I'll ask that you allow me to—" "You asked a yes or no question," Clara said, "and I answered it. I'll be glad to elaborate if it would help." She kept her voice level. "When I began examining Mr. Cross's records, I didn't know Mr. Pruitt's name appeared in them. I found the discrepancy in the Cross ledger first. The connection to Mr. Pruitt's receipt emerged during Sheriff Aldridge's investigation after I had already completed my primary analysis and submitted it. You can verify the dates of submission against the dates of receipt collection from Aldridge's records. I'd suggest doing so because the timeline makes it impossible for me to have targeted Mr. Pruitt's receipt before discovering the discrepancy." The courtroom was very quiet. Colfax looked at her for a long moment. Clara looked back at him and thought about what Cross had said, He'll find something that rattles you and press on it. She felt the thing he was looking for. She felt him looking. She held the stillness she needed to hold and did not give it to him. He tried twice more. He questioned the interpretation of a notation in the second ledger. She walked him through the interpretation step by step until the logic was unavoidable and he had to move on. He suggested that 2 figures in the supply purchase analysis could be read as administrative fees rather than fraudulent overcharges. She explained calmly and in full why they could not, and cited 3 comparable purchase records from the same period that established the normal fee structure and showed the deviation clearly. When he sat down, his face was neutral and professional, and told her nothing. But Voss was making a small mark in his notes with the satisfied precision of a man tallying something. The jury was out for 4 hours. Clara sat in the hallway outside the courtroom on a wooden bench and did not talk to Cross, who sat beside her, and also did not talk, which was exactly what she needed. Reyes stood at the far end of the hall. Through the window, the January afternoon was going blue and cold. At 3:30, the jury came back, guilty on both counts: fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud. The conspiracy charge because Aldridge had found Tom Davies in San Antonio the previous month, and Davies, faced with the evidence Clara had compiled, had cooperated fully and confirmed the arrangement with Pruitt in exchange for a reduced sentence. Davies had identified 2 other buyers involved in the receipt falsification. Both had settled with the county before the trial began. Gerald Pruitt stood when the verdict was read, and his face did something complicated that Clara watched without satisfaction and without guilt. He had done what he'd done. The numbers had said so. The jury had agreed. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt something quieter than that the particular piece of a thing completed a column of figures that had finally added up correctly. She was still sitting on the bench when Cross came out of the courtroom and stopped in front of her. "It's done," he said. "Yes." He sat down beside her. Not close, he was always careful about distance, always precise about it, but close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him against the cold air coming from the window. "How are you?" he said. It was such a simple question that it caught her the way simple things catch you when you've been braced for complexity. She thought about it honestly. "Tired," she said, "and glad." That's the right way to feel. They sat there for a moment, in the blue hallway light, and outside, Harlan Creek was waiting. The way it had always been, waiting, small and certain of itself. And some things about it would be different now, and some things would be exactly the same, and Clara Whitmore understood both of those facts with equal clarity. She reached down and picked up her leather case. She stood up. Ethan Cross stood up beside her. "I want to talk to you about the permanent position," she said. "The accounting work for the ranch. When you're ready." "I'm ready now," Cross said. "Then tomorrow," Clara said. 7:30. Something moved across his face, that not quite a smile that she'd been watching for 2 months and had stopped pretending she wasn't watching for. 7:30, he said. She walked out into the January cold, and her breath made a cloud in the air, and the stars were beginning to show at the edge of the sky. And behind her, she could hear Cross's boots on the courthouse steps, steady and unhurried, following at the exact distance that was his particular way of being present without pressing. And she thought that this was what it felt like when the numbers finally came out right. Not loud, not dramatic, just true. The permanent position changed things in ways Clara hadn't fully anticipated. Not the work itself. The work was exactly what she'd expected, which was to say it was demanding and precise and satisfying in the way that only work you're genuinely suited for can be satisfying. She came at 7:30 every morning except Sunday, and she left before dark, and in between, she rebuilt the Cross Ranch's financial records from the ground up, establishing systems that didn't exist before, creating structures that would survive whoever came after her, and would make a scheme like Davies's impossible to hide. She cross-referenced everything. She built redundancies. She made the books airtight in the way that a well-constructed argument is airtight, not because it's complicated, but because every step follows from the one before it, with no gap for doubt to enter. What she hadn't anticipated was what the permanence did to the town. It took about 3 weeks. In the first week after the verdict, Harlan Creek was careful with her, the particular carefulness of a place that has been proven wrong and is still deciding how to arrange its face about it. People greeted her on the boardwalk with a neutrality that was itself a kind of acknowledgement. Mrs. Helena Cross, who had suggested the charity of Reverend Moore, on the morning of October 9th, crossed the street when she saw Clara coming. Clara let her cross it. She had no use for that woman's discomfort and no interest in pursuing it. The sewing work came back in the second week. Not all of it. 2 of the 3 women who had pulled away stayed away, which was their right and not something Clara wasted energy on, but enough of it, and with it, a certain recalibration of how the town understood the ledger of what Clara Whitmore was owed. It was in the 3rd week that Harlan Creek began carefully and without fanfare to need her. A man named Guthrie, who ran the feed store, came to her father's house on a Wednesday evening and asked hat in hand whether Miss Whitmore might be willing to look at his accounts on a consulting basis. His bookkeeper had left for Abilene in December, and he was behind on his quarterly statements. Clara looked at him for a moment. This was a man who had been in Pruitt's store on October 9th and had said nothing done, nothing simply watched. And then she told him her rate, which was fair and not punitive, and said she could see him Thursday afternoon if he brought the relevant documents. He brought them. She did the work. She did it as well as she did everything. By March, she had 4 consulting clients in addition to the ranch. By May, it was 7. She was keeping more hours than she strictly had available, and she sat down one evening with her own ledger, the private one, the one she ran for herself, and looked at the numbers and understood that she had arrived at a threshold she hadn't known she was approaching. She talked to her father about it on a Sunday, which was the day she kept for home and for him. He was well enough now to sit on the porch in the afternoon, wrapped in a blanket, watching the road with the patient interest of a man who has been given back time he thought was gone. "I want to open an office," she said. Her father turned to look at her. "Not large, a single room if I can find the right space. An actual office where clients can come to me rather than me going to them, where I can keep the records properly, where—" She stopped herself from listing further, because she could hear herself beginning to argue for it before he'd had a chance to respond. "I think it's time," she said simply. Her father was quiet for a moment. "Do you have the capital?" "Almost. I need another month, maybe 6 weeks." "Where are you thinking?" "There's a room above the post office that Caldwell's been renting as storage. Mrs. Alderman told me last week he's thinking of letting it go." She paused. "It's on the main street. It's visible." "That's intentional," her father said. "Not a question." "Yes," Clara said. "It's intentional." He nodded slowly. He looked back at the road. "Your mother would have done the same thing," he said. "In about a third of the time." Clara laughed, a real one, surprised out of her. "That's probably true." "Talk to Caldwell," her father said. "And talk to Cross. He'll have thoughts." She hadn't planned to talk to Cross about it before it was settled. She'd been careful through the months of working permanence to maintain the professional clarity of the arrangement. He was her primary employer, she was his accountant. The work was the work, and she didn't bring her private calculations into his office. But her father was right, that he would have thoughts, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that she wanted to hear them. She told him on a Tuesday morning in April, between finishing the quarterly summary and the start of a meeting he had with a cattle buyer from Dallas. She laid it out plainly, the way she laid everything out, the plan, the timeline, the clients. She already had the capital position, the room above the post office. Cross listened the way he always listened, with his full attention, and no performance of it. When she finished, he said, "The Cross Ranch account goes with you. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. The account goes with you. Whatever your office rate is, that's what we'll pay." He said it with the finality that meant the subject was settled in his mind. "What do you need to make up the difference in capital before you can sign a lease?" "Nothing," Clara said. "I told you another month." Clara. He looked at her steadily. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering to advance 2 months of consulting fees which I owe you anyway, and would be paying on the regular schedule regardless. You can apply them to the lease now instead of waiting. She looked at him. She thought about October 9th and 3 coins on a counter, and the specific quality of Gerald Pruitt's boredom. She thought about how different this was from that, not because the money was coming from someone willing to give it, but because of the precise structure of it, the way he'd framed it, so there was nothing in it that required her to diminish herself. All right, she said. Good. He picked up his hat. Talk to Caldwell today. Don't let him drag it out. He'll drag it out if you give him room to. She signed the lease on a Thursday in April in Mrs. Alderman's post office, with Mrs. Alderman herself as a witness, which was either a practical choice or a deliberate one, depending on how you looked at it. The room was small and needed cleaning, and the window faced west, which meant afternoon light, which suited her. She spent the weekend putting it in order and moved her first client in on Monday. By June, she had a sign on the door. Clara Whitmore, Financial Accounts and Consulting. Plain black letters on a white board, nothing ornate. She'd painted it herself on a Sunday afternoon while her father sat on a chair outside and told her the letters needed to be straighter, and she'd told him that they were straight, and his eyes were going, and he'd laughed, and she'd smiled at the sign and thought it was fine. It was a Tuesday in early June when Ethan Cross came to her office for the first time. Not for the accounts. Reyes handled the document transfers, now the regular back and forth of receipts and ledger pages that kept the ranch's books current. Cross came on a Tuesday afternoon when she had an hour between clients, and he knocked on the frame of the open door and stood there with his hat in his hand in the way she still recognized from October 9th from Pruitt's store from every doorway he'd occupied in the months between then and now. I want to talk to you, he said. Not about the accounts. Clara set down her pen. All right, she said. He came in and sat down in the client chair across from her desk, the same posture he'd had across from her in his own office all those months, forearms on the desk, direct, and she waited. I've been trying to find the right time to say this for about 3 months, he said, and I've decided there isn't a right time. There's just time, and this is what I have. Clara said nothing. You know what I think of you, he said. I've never been able to hide what I think, which you've probably noticed. You are the most... He stopped, recalibrated, which she'd never seen him do before. I'm not good at this, he said. I'm better at knowing what I mean than at saying it. You're usually very good at saying what you mean, Clara said carefully. Not about this. He looked at her directly, which was the only way he ever looked at anyone, but the directness now had something in it that she'd been seeing for months and had been deciding what to do about. I'm not talking about the work. I know the work. What I mean is... He stopped again, and she could see him arrive at the decision to just say it the way he arrived at all his decisions, by determining that it was the right thing and going ahead. I want more than the work, Clara. I have for a long time, and I'm not going to do anything about it without knowing whether you want that too, because whatever you decide, the work stays, and the office stays, and none of that changes. But I needed you to know, because I'm tired of knowing something that important, and acting like I don't. The office was quiet. Down through the window, she could hear the sound of the main street, the particular mid-afternoon rhythm of a small town going about its business horses. Voices, the distant sound of something being hammered somewhere. She had known this was coming. She had known it for months in the way. You know something you're not ready to put words around, felt it in the 7:30 mornings, and the cups of coffee set down without asking, and the way he'd said her name in that kitchen the first time, naturally without deciding to. She had known, and had been patient with her own knowing the way she was patient with figures that needed more data before they could resolve. She had enough data now. Ethan, she said. His name just that without Miss or Mr. in front of it. He waited. I've been a woman in this town with nothing but a worn dress and 3 coins and work that nobody wanted to take seriously, she said. You are the first person who took the work seriously before you took anything else seriously, and I need you to understand that that is not a small thing. That is not something I'm able to set aside when I decide how I feel about a person. I understand that, he said. I need to keep the office, she said. Whatever happens between us, I need the office and the work and the clients and the sign on the door to stay mine, not ours, mine. They're yours, Cross said. They were always yours. I advanced 2 months of fees. I didn't buy anything. I know, she said. I needed to say it out loud. Say anything you need to say out loud, he said. I'll be here. She looked at him across the desk. This man who had walked into a store and said 6 words and changed the direction of her life without meaning to, or maybe meaning to. In some way he hadn't yet understood himself. This man who read slowly and thoroughly and asked the question behind the question and kept a 50-yard distance between himself and things he hadn't been invited into, and who had just told her the most important thing he'd said in 8 months, in the same tone he used to talk about cattle inventory. I want more than the work too, she said. Something happened in his face that she had never seen there before. It wasn't the not quite a smile. It was the thing the not quite a smile had been standing in for all these months, real and unguarded and present in a way that made him look for a moment like a younger man. Like a man who had been holding something carefully for a very long time and had just been told he could set it down. He stood up. He was still holding his hat, and he looked down at it briefly with an expression of faint exasperation, as if he'd only just noticed it was in his hands, and then he set it on the corner of her desk. I should let you get back to work, he said. You should, Clara agreed. I'll pick you up Sunday, he said. For supper, at your father's house. I'll come to the door. My father will make you sit on the porch for 20 minutes and ask you questions about cattle, Clara said. That's fine, Cross said. I know a lot about cattle. He picked up his hat. He walked to the door. He stopped at the frame the way he always stopped at doors, that habitual pause that she'd stopped trying to interpret and had simply learned to wait through. Clara, he said. Yes. That sign. He glanced toward the window, toward the main street where the sign she'd painted was visible from below. It's good. It means something. He left. She heard his boots on the stairs, and then on the street below, and then not at all. She sat for a moment with her hands folded on the desk and looked at nothing in particular and breathed. Then she picked up her pen and pulled the next client's file toward her and opened it and found her place. Sunday came the way Sundays do in a Texas. June warm and unhurried, and Ethan Cross arrived at her father's house at 6 o'clock exactly, which she'd have expected. And he sat on the porch for 20 minutes while her father asked him about cattle, which she'd also expected. And she stood inside the front room and listened to the conversation through the open window and found that her father was asking better questions than she'd anticipated, and that Cross was answering them without performance or impatience, in the same way he answered everything as though the question deserved a real answer, and the person asking it deserved it given directly. At supper, her father said, I remember you, you know, before you were a rancher. You came through Harlan Creek maybe 10 years ago, passing through, didn't stop long. Cross looked at him. I remember Harlan Creek from that time, he said carefully. You were looking for someone. Yes. Did you find them? Eventually, Cross said. In Laredo. Her father nodded. Good, he said, in a tone that meant he understood what the word eventually cost, and wasn't going to press on it. He passed the bread. More. After supper, her father excused himself to bed with the tactfulness of a man who had raised a daughter with enough trust to leave her to her own conclusions, and Clara and Cross sat on the porch in the June dark, and the stars were out the way they'd been out on the night she'd walked home from Millfield after the trial, sharp and indifferent, and more numerous than seems possible. He likes you, Clara said. He's a good man, Cross said. He raised someone remarkable. He gets credit for that. Clara looked at the road. The lights of Harlan Creek were visible at the far end of it, faint and warm and ordinary, the lights of a town going about its evening business. The same town that had watched her stand at a counter with 3 insufficient coins and found it either boring or entertaining, depending on where you stood. She thought about how much had changed and how much had not. The town was the same. The people in it were largely the same. Gerald Pruitt's store had a new owner. Now Pruitt himself had sold it during the trial proceedings and left Harlan Creek, and no one had said much about his leaving in either direction. The new owner was a quiet man named Fletcher who extended credit in reasonable circumstances and did not find poverty amusing. It was not a revolution. It was one small thing changed in one small store in one small town, and it had required a fraud investigation and a county trial, and months of documented evidence to bring about. And yet, there was a sign on a door above the post office, with her name on it, in letters she had painted herself. And yet 7 clients came through that door with their accounts in hand, trusting her with the thing that mattered most to them after their families, the numbers that held their livelihoods together. And yet, she was sitting on her father's porch on a June evening with a man who had walked into a room and said what needed to be said, and had not in all the months since looked away from what she was. "I keep thinking about what you said in that store," Clara said. "You people ought to be ashamed." It needed saying. Did it change anything for any of them? Cross was quiet for a moment. "Probably not," he said. "Not right away. Not because of those words." He looked at the road the way her father had looked at it in the afternoons, with a particular settled attention. "But you changed things. What you did in those ledgers in that courtroom, that changed things. Not their hearts maybe, but the ground they stand on. It's different now. They know that someone is keeping accurate count." Clara absorbed that. It sat right with her in a way that pure optimism wouldn't have. She'd never been a woman given to optimism without evidence, and what Cross had just described was evidence. A shift in structure rather than a conversion of spirit and structure was something she understood. "Accurate count," she said. "That's all I ever wanted." "I know," Cross said. "That's what makes you dangerous." She looked at him. He was looking at the road still, but there was something at the corner of his mouth that she recognized now that she'd been cataloging for months, without admitting she was cataloging it. "Dangerous," she said. "To people who are counting on nobody checking," he said. "Yes, extremely." She thought about October 9th. She thought about the dress, her mother's dress, faded and too narrow across the shoulders, hanging now in the back of her wardrobe, because she hadn't thrown it away and didn't intend to. Not as a wound to carry, as a record. As the first entry in a ledger that had grown in 8 months to something she could not have imagined when she'd set 3 coins on Gerald Pruitt's counter and said please. She had not become like them. She had not needed to. She had not forgotten a single thing about who she was, or where she'd come from, or what it had felt like to stand in that room and be invisible. And now Harlan Creek came to her door. Not all of it. Not with apology. Small towns don't offer apologies. They offer the thing they value most, which is their business, their trust, their tacit acknowledgement that you have become someone they cannot afford to overlook. It was not the validation she'd once thought she needed. It was something better than validation. It was simply the truth, documented, irrefutable, written in the ledger that she kept with her own hand. Clara Whitmore had done the work. The work had spoken, and in the end, the numbers never lied.